Okay, let's unpack this. Here's a surprise for you. The U.S. economy actually shrank in the first 3 months of 2025.
Shrank. By how much?
We're talking a 0.3% contraction.
Wow.
Now, to put that in perspective, that's the worst showing in, well, 3 years. And it's a pretty sharp U-turn from the 2.4% growth we saw just the quarter before.
Right. That's a big swing, and this is happening right at the start of President Trump's second term.
Exactly. The term that was supposed to kick off a new golden age, economically speaking.
Hmm. So inevitably, people are looking at the new policies, right? Like these tariffs. Are they playing a role in this slowdown?
That's the big question. It definitely, challenges that initial optimistic narrative.
It really does. Makes you want to dig into the cause and effect here.
Totally. So for you, the learner, our mission today is pretty clear. We're diving deep into this economic contraction.
And focusing specifically on one potential major driver.
President Trump's newly implemented tariff policies.
Yeah.
We'll try to break down what these tariffs are, what they're supposed to achieve, and the initial economic ripples they've created.
And we're drawing on some specific sources for this.
We are. We're looking at recent reports,
That's like,
analyses, trying to give you the core info without, the usual economic jargon or taking any political sides.
Good. So what are the main sources?
Primarily two. First, there's a Politico report. It gives us a good snapshot of this Q1 GDP contraction and how people reacted, like, right away.
Okay. The immediate impact picture.
Exactly. And second, a pretty comprehensive Wikipedia entry that details the tariff policies themselves from this second Trump administration.
Ah, so the policy details. That combination should give us a solid view, the event, and the potential policy behind it.
That's the plan. All right, so let's jump right into that headline figure again. 0.3% GDP contraction, Q1 2025.
Worst in 3 years. Significant drop from the previous quarter's growth. Got it.
Now, President Trump, he had his own take on this pretty quickly. Took to Truth Social.
Oh, yeah. What did he say? Did he blame the tariffs?
Not at all. He dismissed any connection to his new tariffs. Instead, he blamed what he called the Biden overhang.
The Biden overhang.
And he suggested his tariffs haven't really kicked in yet, but they will lead to an economic boom.
Yeah.
He literally posted, "Be patient," in all caps.
Patience. But what are others saying? Does that explanation hold up?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. That Politico article, it presents a very different narrative.
How so?
It suggests that Trump's tariff policy itself is being seen by many as a major factor contributing to the contraction.
Really? How does that work?
They point to this surge in demand for foreign goods earlier in the year. Apparently, U.S. businesses were scrambling to stock up on imports before the new tariffs hit.
Trying to beat the deadline. Makes sense.
Right. But that buying spree, it led to a record-high trade deficit in March.
And a higher trade deficit actually subtracts from GDP, right?
Exactly. It's an accounting thing, but it pulls the number down.
Okay, so the attempt to avoid the tariffs might have, ironically, worsened the immediate GDP figure.
Seems like it. And Britt Ryan, he's a senior economist at Deutsche Bank. He's quoted in that Politico piece.
What's his take?
He notes that the original thinking was that extending the 2017 tax cuts would, provide enough economic juice to sort of offset any negative trade impacts.
Right, the tax cuts were meant to boost growth.
But Ryan says, and I'm quoting here, that script has been flipped. He thinks the negative effects from the tariffs are now actually outweighing any boost from the tax policy.
Wow, so the tariffs are proving more disruptive than expected, at least initially.
Seems that way. And the political fallout. Well, it's hard to ignore.
I bet. What are people saying on that front?
Douglas Holt-Seakin, you might remember him, former advisor to John McCain.
Sure.
He said there's basically no good news on the economic front. And he points out that since Trump's election really hinged on his economic promises.
Yeah, that was central.
This contraction creates a real problem, potentially undermining his mandate to push this whole trade agenda through.
That makes sense. It weakens his hand politically if the economy's stumbling right out of the gate.
Definitely. However, the White House isn't exactly throwing in the towel.
No. What's their line?
Reportedly, aides are trying to emphasize the positive underlying numbers from Q1. Things like consumer spending, private investment, arguing the fundamentals are still sound.
Okay, looking for silver linings.
And Peter Navarro, who's a key trade advisor for Trump.
Right, very prominent on trade.
He actually called this negative GDP number the best negative print he'd ever seen.
Yeah, best negative print. That's That's certainly a unique perspective.
It is. But despite that kind of optimistic spin from some, the Politico report really highlights these rising worries about a potential recession.
And those worries are linked to the tariffs.
Directly. Among economists, CEOs on Wall Street. It's the uncertainty from the tariffs, especially how quickly they were rolled out and then adjusted, that's causing jitters.
Hmm. And is this feeling filtering down, like, to consumers?
Seems so. The Conference Board did a survey, Consumer Expectations for the Future. They've apparently tanked to their lowest point since 2011.
Oof, that's quite low.
Yeah, and big companies like Delta, GM, UPS, they've reportedly either revised or even withdrawn their financial forecasts, specifically citing the uncertainty around these tariffs.
Okay, so businesses are feeling it directly in their planning. It's tangible.
Definitely. Now, the stock market, that's been a bit of a roller coaster, hasn't it?
Yeah, what's the story there?
Well, the Politico piece mentions some days where it climbed, maybe based on hints about trade talks progressing.
Right, always sensitive to negotiation news.
But it also points out this underlying anxiety. How are these higher trade barriers ultimately going to affect company growth, consumer prices? That uncertainty is still there.
Makes sense. Mixed signals.
And even Arthur Laffer, longtime Trump supporter, economic advisor.
Sure, the Laffer curve guy.
Even he didn't mince words. He's quoted saying, tariffs cause hell with the economy.
Wow. From Laffer.
Yeah. And he said he hoped Trump would eventually cut them significantly. He even admitted that during trade talks, Trump scares the hell out of me like he scares the hell out of everyone else.
That's remarkably blunt, especially from him.
It is, but on the flip side, you have Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Larry Kudlow, another former Trump advisor.
Right.
They're pointing out that, hey, unemployment is still low. Consumer spending was actually strong in March.
Okay, so there are some positive indicators still.
Yeah, they argue the basic economic fundamentals are still solid. And the Politico report does acknowledge that. Stronger consumer spending and private investment did partly offset the hit from the trade deficit.
So it could have been worse.
Potentially. Real final sales to private domestic purchasers, basically, underlying demand that actually grew by a decent 3%.
Okay. And inflation. Where's that at?
Excluding food and energy, the annual rate in March was about 2.6%. So not completely out of control, but
The tariffs could push that up later.
that's the worry. The potential for rising import costs driven by tariffs to eventually mean higher prices for consumers. And maybe even companies laying off workers if costs get too high.
Right, the downstream effects.
And that Conference Board survey, it also showed consumers getting hesitant about big purchases, vacations, and feeling like there are fewer job opportunities.
So a potential cooling off there, too.
And that ties into hiring. The Business Roundtable, they survey top CEOs.
Yep.
Their survey showed a sharp drop in the number of businesses planning to increase their workforce in the next 6 months.
Ouch. That's a forward-looking indicator.
It is. And the Labor Department reported job openings fell in March to the lowest since late 2020.
So signs of softening in the labor market.
Potentially. Brett Ryan, the Deutsche Bank economist, again, he connects these dots. He says trade uncertainty has a depressing effect on firm spending on CapEx and on hiring.
Right. Businesses pause investment in hiring when things are uncertain. And just so you know, the learner, CAPEX, is capital expenditure companies spending on big things like equipment or buildings.
Exactly. So Ryan argues this uncertainty leads to slower income growth eventually. Even with low unemployment now, the tariffs might be setting up challenges down the road.
A lot to unpack there on the immediate economic picture. Seems quite mixed, but with definite warning signs linked to trade policy.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the specifics of these tariff policies themselves.
Right, because the scale and speed seem noteworthy.
They really are. According to that Wikipedia entry we mentioned, between January and April 2025, just a few months, the average effective U.S. tariff rate, it went from about 2.5%
Okay, pretty low historic.
to an estimated 27%.
27%. That's huge. Highest in over a century, it says.
That's what the source claims. A massive jump in a very short time.
And we know President Trump has liked tariffs for a long time, right? It's not a new idea for him.
Not at all. The Wikipedia entry reminds us he's advocated for them since way back in the 80s. He sees them as a tool for all sorts of things.
Like what?
Regulating trade, obviously, retaliating against other countries, but also preventing wars, reducing deficits,
Yeah.
Even funding domestic stuff like childcare subsidies, it's a very broad view.
Or a real multi-tool in his policy toolkit.
You could say that. And while he often says, that foreign countries pay the tariffs,
Yeah, that's a common refrain.
the reality, as the Wikipedia entry lays out pretty clearly, is that U.S. consumers and businesses end up paying, either directly as duties or indirectly through higher prices.
Right. Basic economics, usually.
And the idea that tariff money could replace income taxes. The entry says tariffs would raise way less revenue, and that revenue would probably shrink over time anyway as imports fall.
Okay, so it's not a magic money machine.
Doesn't seem like it. And President Trump himself, he did acknowledge these tariffs might cause some pain for Americans.
He admitted that.
Yeah, but he insisted it will all be worth the price. Pretty resolute.
Okay. Now, how were these actually put in place so quickly? That 2.5% to 27% jump is incredibly fast.
That's a key point, the method. President Trump used the National Emergencies Act, the NEA, and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
Emergency powers.
Exactly. He declared multiple national emergencies, things related to border security, the trade deficit, and these acts let him bypass the usual, often lengthy procedures for putting tariffs in place.
So using emergency laws meant for, well, emergencies to enact broad trade policy.
That's the argument. The Wikipedia entry notes that while IEPA has been used for sanctions before, using it for such wide-ranging tariffs is pretty unprecedented.
And did Trump say why he used that approach?
Well, he was quoted when signing the orders saying that declaring an emergency means you can do whatever you have to do to get out of that problem.
Whatever you have to do. That sounds like getting around obstacles.
And that use of emergency powers definitely raised some eyebrows. The New York Times, cited in the entry, reported that lots of economists and legal experts think this emergency rationale was basically a strategy.
Strategy to do what?
To get around Congress, avoid needing their approval, and also to sidestep international trade rules.
So pushing the boundaries of executive power, basically.
That's the concern being raised. Big questions about separation of powers.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. What were some of these tariffs? It sounds like a lot happened quickly.
It was a blizzard. Okay, so the Wikipedia entry details a few key ones. First, a flat 10% tariff on all imports into the U.S., effective April 5th.
10% across the board. Wow. Declared under that trade deficit emergency.
Correct. Emergency declared April 2nd, tariff effective April 5th. Then, on top of that, higher tariffs for 57 specific countries and territories starting April 9th.
Oh.
And these were in addition to existing measures, like on Chinese goods. The result was that the effective rate on imports from China jumped to about 54%.
54% on Chinese goods. That's huge.
And it didn't stop there. Remember the USMCA, the trade deal with Canada and Mexico?
Yeah.
A 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico was announced right after the re-election, started back in February.
25% on neighbors and key partners.
Yep. Though there were some later adjustments, a reduction to 10% for Canadian energy, some delays for goods that comply with USMCA rules, but still, a big hit.
Okay. What else? China got hit again?
Oh, yeah. China faced a relentless escalation. It started with 10% in February, justified by a national emergency over drug trafficking, apparently.
Okay.
That went up to 20% in March. And then further increases led to a total effective rate of 145%